Welcome to Brain Speak Audiobooks, where great stories truly live.
There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a crowded room. Not the silence of empty space, but the silence of being surrounded by 40, 50, 60 people, and somehow occupying none of their attention. I know that silence intimately. I lived inside it for the better part of a decade. The night I remember most clearly was a rooftop reception in a city I had just moved to, thrown by a company I was desperate to work with. I had rehearsed my introduction in the elevator. I had practiced my handshake in the bathroom mirror that morning. I wore the blazer I'd bought specifically for nights like this one, the kind of blazer that is supposed to say something about you before you open your mouth. And I walked into that room with every intention of being remembered. 2 hours later, I left having spoken to exactly 4 people, none of whom would recognize me if we passed on the street the next day. I had stood near 3 different conversation circles, waiting for a natural opening, and each time the group had shifted, closed a fraction tighter, and continued without acknowledging that I existed. Not out of cruelty. Out of something far more unsettling. They genuinely hadn't registered me as present. I want you to sit with that distinction for a moment, because it is the entire foundation of what this audiobook is built on. Being ignored because people dislike you is painful, but it is at least a response. Being ignored because people's nervous systems never flagged you as worth attending to in the first place is a different category of invisibility altogether. And for years, that was my default setting in any room with more than 5 people in it. Here is what nobody tells you about social invisibility. It has almost nothing to do with what you say. I know that sounds impossible, especially if you've spent your life the way I spent mine, rehearsing clever things to say, memorizing facts to drop into conversation, preparing questions that were supposed to make me interesting. I treated charisma as a vocabulary problem. If I could just find the right words, I believed, people would finally see me. It took a humiliating amount of research, a psychology degree I picked up almost by accident while trying to understand why I kept failing socially, and roughly 4 years of deliberate, almost obsessive observation of people who commanded rooms effortlessly before I understood the truth. Charisma is not what you say. Charisma is what your body says before your mouth opens, what your voice carries beneath the words, what your eyes do in the first 4 seconds of contact, and what your presence communicates about status, safety, and attention before a single sentence has been exchanged. The people who own a room the moment they enter it are not smarter than you. In many cases, and I say this from direct observation over years of studying this phenomenon, they're not even more interesting than you, in terms of raw information or wit. What they have is a set of signals, mostly unconscious, that the human nervous system is hardwired to read as significant. And once I learned to see those signals, I could not unsee them. More importantly, I could learn to produce them myself. This audiobook is the map I wish someone had handed me that night on the rooftop, instead of leaving me to spend years reverse engineering it alone through failure, research, and an increasingly obsessive study of behavioral psychology, nonverbal communication, and the architecture of social influence. It draws on the work of researchers who spent their careers studying exactly this question. What separates the people rooms gravitate toward from the people rooms drift past? Amy Cuddy's research on how posture shapes both perception and internal chemistry. Paul Ekman's decades of work decoding the human face. Albert Mehrabian's studies on the layered channels of communication. Robert Cialdini's work on the psychology of influence. Vanessa Van Edwards' behavioral research on what she calls charisma signals. Daniel Goleman's framework for emotional and social intelligence. This is not a collection of manipulation tactics. It is a study of how humans actually decide, in fractions of a second and almost entirely below conscious awareness, who deserves their attention, their trust, and their respect. By the end of this audiobook, you will understand why some people are remembered after 30 seconds and others are forgotten after 30 minutes. You will understand what your body has been unconsciously broadcasting your entire life, and how to change the broadcast. You will understand the difference between charisma built on ethical influence and charisma built on manipulation, because that distinction matters, and we will not blur it. But first, I need you to understand something uncomfortable. The reason you have not yet built the social presence you want is almost never a personality flaw. It is a skill gap. Nobody taught you this. Nobody sits children down and explains proxemics, or the 7-second window in which a first impression calcifies, or how vocal tone overrides the actual content of your words in the listener's brain. This is a language, and like any language, it can be learned by anyone willing to study it deliberately. I am living proof of that, and by the end of this audiobook, so will you be. Before we dive in, I want to ask you something, because your answer is going to matter more than you think as we move through this material. Think about the last time you walked into a room, a meeting, a party, a networking event, and felt like you disappeared. Drop your answer in the comments right now. What's the one word that best describes how that moment felt? Invisible? Frozen? Small? Just one word. I read every single one, and I want to know exactly where you're starting from, because everything in this audiobook is designed to change that word by the time we reach the end. If you're the kind of person who takes their social presence as seriously as their career or their health, hit subscribe now. This channel exists for people who refuse to accept invisibility as a personality trait, and subscribing tells the algorithm to keep this kind of content coming to you. The silence signals nobody taught you. There is an experiment that has been repeated, in various forms, across dozens of psychology labs, and the results never stop being unsettling to the people encountering them for the first time. Show participants a silent video clip of two people interacting, no audio, no context, just a few seconds of footage, and ask them to guess which person holds more power in the relationship. Across cultures, across age groups, across nearly every demographic researchers have tested, people guess correctly at rates far higher than chance would predict. Sometimes in under 2 seconds of footage. Think about what that means. Before either person has spoken a single word, before any context about their jobs, their achievements, or their history has been revealed, observers can accurately identify status, dominance, and social rank purely from body language. Your nervous system already knows how to read this language fluently. You have been reading it your entire life, every day, in every interaction. What you have not been taught is how to write it. This is the first shift I need you to make, because almost everything else in this audiobook depends on it. Communication is not one channel. It is several channels running simultaneously, and they do not carry equal weight. The research most commonly cited here comes from Albert Mehrabian, whose studies in the late 1960s examined how people interpret emotional communication when the verbal content, the tone of voice, and the facial expression are inconsistent with one another. His finding, frequently oversimplified into a rigid percentage breakdown that gets misapplied far beyond its original context, nonetheless points to something researchers have continued to validate in different ways for decades since. When the channels conflict, people trust the nonverbal signal over the verbal one. If your words say confidence but your body says fear, the room believes your body. This is why you can memorize the perfect thing to say and still walk away from the conversation feeling like it fell flat. The words were never the problem. The problem was everything happening underneath them, the signals you were sending without realizing you were sending anything at all. Let me walk you through what those signals actually are, because once you can name them, you can start to notice them in yourself and in every person you interact with, and that noticing is the beginning of control. The first signal is what researchers call expansiveness, and it has almost nothing to do with height or size. It has to do with how much space a person's body claims relative to the space available. Watch footage of any executive, any respected leader, any person the room naturally orients toward, and you will notice they tend to take up more physical space than the average person in the same setting. Their gestures are broader. Their stance is wider. Their arms are not clamped to their sides. Compare this to the posture of someone feeling anxious or subordinate in a given setting, and you will almost always see the opposite: shoulders pulled inward, arms crossed or held close to the body, a physical shrinking that mirrors the emotional shrinking happening underneath it. Amy Cuddy's research at Harvard examined this relationship in both directions, not just how expansive posture is perceived by others, but how adopting expansive posture actually changes the internal chemistry of the person holding it. Her studies measured shifts in testosterone and cortisol after participants held expansive versus contractive postures for just a few minutes, finding that expansive posture was associated with increases in the hormone linked to confidence and decreases in the hormone linked to stress. The causality here has been debated and refined by subsequent research, and I want to be honest with you about that rather than oversell a simplified version of the finding. But the core insight survives the scrutiny. Posture is not just an output of how you feel. It is an input. You do not simply stand confidently because you feel confident. In part, you can begin to feel confident because you are standing that way. This matters enormously for the room that didn't see me, the room I described at the beginning of this audiobook. I did not fail that night because I lacked interesting things to say. I failed because I walked into that room with my shoulders curved slightly forward, my drink held at chest height like a small shield, my feet close together, my whole physical presence organized around taking up as little space as possible. I was broadcasting subordinate status before I said a single word, and the room read that broadcast perfectly, then moved on to more interesting signals. The second signal is stillness, and this one surprises people, because our instinct is to assume that more movement equals more energy equals more charisma. The opposite is usually true. Watch someone who is nervous in a social setting and you will see a body full of small, fast, purposeless movements, fidgeting hands, shifting weight from foot to foot, touching the face repeatedly, adjusting clothing that does not need adjusting. Now watch someone who commands a room, and you will typically see something closer to economy of movement. Their gestures, when they happen, are deliberate and complete. Their stillness, when they are still, is total. This connects to a broader principle in nonverbal research. Unnecessary movement reads as anxiety, and anxiety reads as low status, because in evolutionary terms, the anxious creature is the one anticipating threat, and the calm creature is the one who does not need to. A room, at an almost animal level, orients toward the calm creature, because calm signals safety, and safety is magnetic. This does not mean becoming rigid or robotic. It means eliminating the small, leaking movements that broadcast internal anxiety, so that the movements you do make land with weight and intention. The third signal is eye contact, and this is where most people overcorrect in one direction or the other after learning it matters. Some people, once told that eye contact projects confidence, adopt an unblinking stare that reads as aggressive or unsettling rather than confident. Others remain too afraid of that outcome and continue avoiding eye contact almost entirely, which reads as evasive or submissive. The actual research points toward a rhythm rather than an intensity. Confident eye contact tends to be held for roughly the duration of a natural thought, then broken smoothly, not darted away in discomfort, before returning. It is a rhythm of engagement and release, not a fixed stare or a nervous flicker. Paul Ekman's decades of research into facial expression add another layer here, because the eyes do not operate in isolation. They operate as part of a facial system that people read, consciously and unconsciously, for signs of authenticity. Ekman's work on what he termed microexpressions, brief involuntary facial movements that reveal genuine emotional states even when someone is trying to mask them, demonstrated that the human face leaks truth in fractions of a second, regardless of what the mouth is saying. A forced smile, for instance, tends to engage only the muscles around the mouth, while a genuine smile, sometimes called a Duchenne smile in the research literature though more properly attributed to Duchenne, engages the muscles around the eyes as well, producing the slight crinkling that people register, often without knowing why, as more trustworthy. This is why some people can say all the right words and still feel slightly off to you, and you cannot always articulate why. Their face is leaking a mismatch between what they are performing and what they are actually feeling, and your nervous system, which has been reading faces since before you could speak, registers the discrepancy even when your conscious mind cannot name it. I want to pause here and address something important, because this audiobook is going to spend a great deal of time teaching you to consciously produce signals that, in socially fluent people, tend to happen automatically. Some of you may be wondering whether this makes the resulting charisma somehow fake, a performance layered over the real you rather than an expression of it. I would push back on that framing, and here is why. Every skill you have ever developed began as conscious, effortful practice before it became automatic. You did not naturally know how to drive a car, hold a difficult conversation at work, or write incomplete sentences. You practiced the mechanics deliberately until they integrated into something that now feels effortless and authentic to you. Nonverbal fluency works exactly the same way. The goal is never to become a person performing a mask. The goal is to become fluent enough in this language that the signals which currently feel foreign and forced eventually become simply how you move through the world, an accurate expression of a more confident internal state that the practice itself helps produce. There is also an ethical line here that I want to draw clearly, because we will return to it throughout this audiobook. Everything I am teaching you is about accurately representing confidence, engagement, and presence that you are cultivating internally as you practice these behaviors. This is fundamentally different from manufacturing false signals to deceive someone about your intentions, your interest, or your character in order to extract something from them. The techniques are the same tools a therapist uses to build rapport with a frightened patient, and a con artist uses to build false trust with a victim. The tool is neutral. The intention behind it is not. We are building the former, and I will keep returning to that distinction throughout this material. Before we move further, try this. The next time you are in any room with other people, spend 30 seconds doing nothing but observing. Watch who takes up space and who shrinks. Watch whose movements are economical and whose are scattered. Watch the rhythm of eye contact around you. You will start to see the language I am describing everywhere, because it was always there. You simply had not yet been taught to read it. Why status is read in milliseconds. In 1970, psychologist Robert Rosenthal ran a study that would quietly reshape how researchers understood human judgment. Participants were shown extremely brief video clips of teachers, sometimes as short as 2 seconds, with no audio, and asked to rate those teachers on qualities like competence and warmth. Their ratings, based on almost nothing, correlated strongly with end-of-semester evaluations from students who had spent an entire term with those same teachers. 2 seconds of silent video predicted months of accumulated experience. This finding has been replicated and extended many times since, across contexts ranging from political candidates to job interviews to speed dating, and the pattern holds with remarkable consistency. Human beings form durable judgments about status, competence, and trustworthiness with almost no information, in a window of time too short for conscious deliberation to have occurred. Whatever process is generating that judgment is happening beneath awareness, fast, automatic, and difficult to override once it is fired. Understanding why this happens requires stepping back into evolutionary context, because the speed of this judgment is not an accident or a flaw in human cognition. It is a feature that kept our ancestors alive. In an environment where encountering an unfamiliar person could mean encountering an ally, a threat, or a potential mate, the ability to rapidly assess status, intention, and danger before extended interaction was a survival advantage. The brain regions responsible for this kind of rapid social assessment, particularly structures involved in threat detection and social categorization, evolved to fire fast and fire first, well before the slower, more deliberate reasoning centers get involved. This means that by the time someone has consciously decided what they think of you, an earlier, faster system has already rendered a verdict, and that verdict is disproportionately influencing the conscious judgment that follows. This is not a metaphor. It is measurable. Studies using facial trustworthiness ratings have found that judgments of trustworthiness, competence, and likability from a face alone, viewed for a fraction of a second, correlate significantly with the same judgments made after unlimited viewing time. The extra time mostly gathers evidence to justify a conclusion the brain already reached almost instantly. I am telling you this not to depress you, but to redirect your attention to where it actually matters. Most people preparing for a high-stakes social interaction, a job interview, a first date, a networking event, spend their preparation time on content. What will I say? What questions will I ask? What story will I tell? This is not wasted effort, and later in this audiobook we will spend considerable time on verbal strategy. But if the room has already formed a durable impression of your status and trustworthiness within the first few seconds, before your carefully prepared content has even begun, then content preparation alone is solving the wrong part of the problem. So what exactly is being read in those first few seconds? Research across social psychology converges on a small number of dimensions that dominate rapid social judgment. The first is warmth, sometimes framed as trustworthiness, essentially an assessment of intention. Is this person friend or foe, safe or dangerous, here to help or here to exploit? The second is competence, sometimes framed as status or capability. Does this person know what they are doing? Do they have the ability to back up their intentions? Are they someone worth taking seriously? Psychologist Susan Fisk's research on social cognition identifies these two dimensions, warmth and competence, as the primary axes along which humans rapidly categorize other people, and the combination matters enormously. Someone read as high warmth but low competence tends to be liked but not respected. The office employee everyone enjoys but nobody defers to on important decisions. Someone read as high competence but low warmth tends to be respected but not trusted, admired from a distance but held at arm's length, often envied rather than embraced. The people who command rooms, the people this audiobook is ultimately teaching you to become, are read as high on both dimensions simultaneously, a combination researchers consistently find is rarer and more magnetic than excellence on either dimension alone. Here is the practical implication, and it is one we will return to repeatedly. Charisma is not simply about projecting power or projecting friendliness. It is about learning to signal both simultaneously, in a way that does not undercut either one. Pure dominant signals, unaccompanied by warmth signals, tend to produce compliance without genuine connection, and often produce quiet resentment that eventually surfaces. Pure warmth signals, unaccompanied by competent signals, tend to produce affection without influence, the kind of likability that never translates into being taken seriously in a room where decisions are being made. Vanessa Van Edwards' behavioral research, conducted through extensive video analysis of social interactions, breaks this down further into what she describes as specific behavioral clusters associated with each dimension. Warmth signals tend to include an open body posture, palms visible rather than hidden, a head tilt during listening, and expressive rather than flat vocal tone. Competence and status signals tend to include a still, grounded posture, a lower and more resonant vocal register, minimal fidgeting, and controlled rather than rushed movement. The people who read as magnetic in her research were not those who maximized one cluster, but those who could flexibly deploy both, warmth to build connection, status signals to build respect, calibrated to the specific social context they were operating in. This is worth sitting with, because it explains a pattern many of you have likely experienced without having language for it. You may know people who are enormously likable in casual settings but somehow disappear in professional ones, unable to translate their warmth into being taken seriously. You may also know the opposite, people who command visible respect in professional contexts but who nobody actually wants to sit next to at dinner, competent but cold. Both are operating on only half the code. The people who genuinely command a room, in any context, have learned to run both channels simultaneously, and adjust the ratio depending on what a given moment calls for. There is a particularly interesting wrinkle in this research worth mentioning, because it will reshape how you think about first impressions going forward. Several studies have found that when people are uncertain about someone's warmth, they tend to weight competence signals more heavily in their overall judgment, essentially treating perceived skill as a proxy for trustworthiness in the absence of clearer information. This is part of why demonstrated competence, doing something skillfully in front of others, tends to accelerate social acceptance even in the absence of extended warmth-building interaction. It is also part of why pure competence, unaccompanied by any warmth signal at all, so often reads as cold or even threatening. The brain, uncertain what to make of raw ability without any accompanying signal of benevolent intention, sometimes defaults to caution rather than admiration. I want to bring this back to something practical you can use immediately, before we go any further into the material ahead. The next time you walk into a room where you want to be remembered, understand that you have a window of roughly the first 10 to 15 seconds where two questions are being answered about you, almost entirely non-verbally, whether you intend to answer them or not. Is this person safe? Is this person capable? Every signal we covered in the previous chapter, expansiveness, stillness, eye contact rhythm, facial authenticity, is data being fed into those two judgments in real time. This is not about performing confidence as a mask over anxiety. It is about understanding precisely what the room is measuring, so that the internal work you do to actually build genuine calm and capability gets translated accurately into the signals that communicate it. You can be the most capable, trustworthy person in a room and still be read as neither, if the signals you are sending contradict the reality underneath them. Closing that gap between who you actually are and what the room perceives in those first 15 seconds is the single highest leverage project you can undertake if social presence is something you want to build deliberately rather than leave to chance. The voice beneath the words. I want to tell you about a moment that reframed everything I thought I understood about communication. I was sitting in on a negotiation, early in my research into this material, watching two people discuss the terms of a business partnership. One of them, I will call him the first speaker, had the stronger argument by any objective measure. His numbers were better. His logic was tighter. His proposal genuinely served both parties more fairly. The second speaker had a weaker case, and both of them likely knew it. By the end of the meeting, the second speaker had won nearly every point he raised. I left trying to understand what had happened, because on paper, the outcome made no sense. It took me several replays of my notes, and eventually a recording, to isolate the variable. It was not what either man said. It was how their voices carried what they said. The first speaker, despite his stronger position, spoke in a register that rose slightly at the end of statements, a pattern linguists call upspeak, which unconsciously signals uncertainty or a question rather than a declaration, even when a sentence is not phrased as a question. His pace was fast, almost rushed, as though he were racing to finish before being interrupted. The second speaker, with a weaker case, spoke slowly, in a lower register, with statements that ended on a falling tone, the vocal signature of certainty. He paused before important points rather than rushing through them. He left silence after his strongest statements instead of immediately filling it, as if daring the room to challenge something so obviously true it did not require further defense. The content of the negotiation mattered. But the voice carrying that content mattered more, and this is one of the most underused levers in the entire architecture of social influence, because almost nobody is taught to think about it deliberately. Let's start with pitch, because it carries some of the most consistent findings in vocal research. Lower vocal pitch is reliably associated, across a wide range of studies, with perceptions of dominance, authority, and competence. This holds for both male and female voices, though the absolute pitch ranges differ, and it appears to be remarkably consistent across cultures, suggesting a deep evolutionary root rather than a purely learned cultural association. Some researchers have connected this to body size signaling in the animal kingdom more broadly, where lower frequency vocalizations tend to correlate with larger body size, and by extension, greater capacity for dominance or threat. Whatever the evolutionary mechanism, the modern effect is measurable and strong. Voters, in studies asking participants to choose between candidates based purely on recorded voice samples, consistently favor the lower-pitched voice, even when all other information is held constant. This does not mean you need to artificially deepen your voice into something that sounds forced or unnatural, which tends to backfire by sounding exactly like what it is, a performance rather than a genuine register. What it does mean is understanding that most people, when nervous, unconsciously raise their pitch, tightening the vocal cords under stress in a way that pushes the voice higher and thinner. This is often the first vocal signal of anxiety a room picks up on, frequently before the speaker has said anything that would consciously reveal nervousness. Learning to consciously drop your shoulders, breathe from the diaphragm rather than the upper chest, and let your natural vocal register settle downward under pressure, rather than letting stress push it upward, is one of the most immediate adjustments available to you. Pace matters just as much as pitch, and here the research points toward a principle that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Slower is almost always more powerful than faster, within reasonable limits. Fast speech tends to read as anxious, eager to please, or defensive, as though the speaker is racing to get their point out before being cut off or challenged. Slower, more deliberate speech tends to read as confident, unhurried, and secure in the assumption that the room will wait for what comes next, because what comes next is worth waiting for. This connects to something I mentioned in the opening chapters about the value of stillness in body language, and the same principle applies to vocal delivery. Nervous speech is often characterized by filled pauses, the ums and us that occupy the space where silence would otherwise sit, because silence itself feels unbearable to a nervous system that has not learned to tolerate it. Confident speech tolerates silence. It uses pause deliberately, letting a strong statement land in quiet, rather than immediately rushing to qualify or soften it. That pause is not empty space. It is where your statement earns its full weight in the listener's mind, before you move on to whatever comes next. I want to be specific about how to practice this, because awareness alone rarely changes behavior under pressure. The technique I have found most effective, and the one I use myself before any high-stakes conversation, is what I think of as the period, not the comma, principle. When you finish a sentence you actually believe, let it end like a period, a clean stop, a breath, a beat of silence, before continuing. Resist the urge to immediately follow it with a softening qualifier, a nervous laugh, or a rushed continuation that undercuts the statement you just made. This single adjustment, practiced deliberately in low-stakes conversations until it becomes natural, will change how your statements land more than almost any other single technique in this audiobook. Vocal variety, sometimes called prosody in linguistic research, is the third major lever, and it operates almost like a spice in cooking, essential in the right amount, damaging in excess or absence. A voice with no variation at all, flat and monotone, reads as disengaged or, in some contexts, as concealing something, because genuine emotional engagement naturally produces vocal variation, and its absence can register, consciously or not, as inauthenticity. But excessive variation, particularly the kind driven by nervous energy rather than genuine emphasis, reads as erratic or performative. The goal is variation that tracks meaning, your pitch and pace shifting to underline the parts of your statement that actually matter, staying level and grounded through the connective tissue in between. I want to bring in Mehrabian's research again here, because it connects directly to this chapter in a way that clarifies something important. When Mehrabian studies examined how listeners resolve conflicting signals between what is said and how it is said, tone of voice consistently outweighed the literal words in determining the emotional meaning the listener extracted. This means the same sentence, delivered with a warm, grounded tone versus a flat or anxious one, will be interpreted by the listener as carrying almost entirely different emotional content, even though the words on the page are identical. Your script matters. Your delivery of that script matters more. This has direct implications for how you should think about preparing for any important conversation. Most people, preparing for a difficult conversation, obsess almost entirely over word choice, drafting and redrafting exactly what they plan to say. Far fewer people rehearse how they intend to say it, the pace, the pauses, the register, even though the research is unambiguous that this second layer is doing more of the emotional work in how they will be received. Try this before your next important conversation. Take the key statement you plan to make, the one sentence that matters most, and say it aloud 5 different ways, rushed and high-pitched, then slow and low, then with a rising question-like inflection at the end, then with a flat, declarative period at the end, then finally in whatever register actually reflects the confidence you want to project. Notice how differently each version lands, even though every word is identical. That difference is the entire subject of this chapter, and it is available to you the moment you choose to pay attention to it. Owning space without saying a word. There is a concept in nonverbal research called proxemics, a term coined by anthropologist Edward Hall in the 1960s to describe the study of how humans use physical space and distance as a form of communication. Hall's research identified distinct zones people unconsciously maintain around themselves, ranging from intimate space reserved for close relationships, through personal and social space used in everyday interaction, out to public space maintained with strangers and in formal settings. What makes this research so relevant to charisma is not the zones themselves, but what happens when someone violates the unspoken rules that govern them, and, more interestingly for our purposes, what it communicates when someone commands space within those rules with unusual confidence. Watch how people move through a crowded room, and you will notice 2 distinct patterns. Some people navigate the room defensively, angling their bodies to slip through gaps, apologizing with their posture for the space they occupy, contracting to minimize the area they take up as they move. Others move through the same crowded room as though the crowd will part for them, which, more often than you would expect, it actually does. This is not about being larger or more physically imposing. It is almost entirely about the confidence with which someone claims the trajectory they intend to walk, and a room reads that confidence, again, in a fraction of a second, and adjusts accordingly. This principle extends directly into how people occupy space while stationary, whether standing in conversation or seated at a table, and it connects back to the expansiveness signal we covered earlier, but with an important additional layer. Status is communicated not just by how much space your body occupies, but by how deliberately and unapologetically you occupy it. Someone who takes up a moderate amount of space but does so with total ease, without the small fidgeting adjustments that signal discomfort, reads as higher status than someone who takes up more space but does so nervously, constantly readjusting as if checking whether the space they've claimed is actually permitted to them. I think of this as the difference between occupying space and apologizing for occupying it. You can watch this distinction play out constantly in ordinary settings. Someone sits down at a shared table and immediately pulls their arms in, angles their body slightly away, minimizes their footprint, as though seeking permission to be there. Someone else sits down at the same table, settles their weight fully into the chair, allows their arms a natural, relaxed range rather than pinning them close, and simply exists in the space without performing any visible negotiation for the right to exist there. The second person, all else being equal, reads as higher status, more grounded, more worth paying attention to, purely through this difference in spatial confidence. There is a related concept worth introducing here, sometimes referred to in behavioral research as postural congruence or synchrony, which describes the tendency of people who feel rapport and connection to unconsciously mirror each other's body language, posture, and even breathing rhythm during conversation. This mirroring happens automatically when genuine rapport is present, and researchers have found that it can also be used deliberately, in a subtle and carefully calibrated way, to accelerate the sense of connection between 2 people who have just met. The mechanism here is worth understanding, because it explains why deliberate mirroring, done well, feels like connection rather than manipulation. When someone mirrors your posture, your gestures, your energy level, at a pace that feels natural rather than obviously imitative, it activates something close to the same neural pathways involved in empathy and social bonding, the sense that this person is attuned to you, moving with you rather than against you. Done clumsily, obviously, or too quickly, mirroring reads as mockery or manipulation, and the effect reverses entirely. Done well, with a natural delay of several seconds and applied to general energy and posture rather than an exact gesture-for-gesture copy, it becomes one of the fastest legitimate tools available for building unconscious rapport with someone you have just met. I want to walk you through how to practice this without it feeling mechanical, because that is the failure mode almost everyone falls into when they first learn this technique. Do not attempt to mirror specific gestures in real time, which almost always reads as strange or obviously performative. Instead, calibrate to the other person's general energy level and pace. If they are speaking slowly and with a relaxed, open posture, allow your own pace and posture to settle into a similar register rather than staying keyed up and rapid in contrast. If they lean in with genuine engagement, allow yourself to lean in as well, several seconds later, rather than instantly. The goal is resonance, not imitation, and the difference between the two is almost entirely a matter of timing and generality versus specificity. There is another dimension to owning space that deserves attention here, and it concerns what happens during silence, specifically the silences that occur naturally within any conversation. Most people experience conversational silence as something uncomfortable that must be immediately filled, and this discomfort itself is a status signal, because it communicates a kind of dependency on the conversation's continuous momentum to feel at ease. Higher status behavior, consistently observed in research on dominance and social rank, includes a greater tolerance for silence, an ability to let a pause exist without visible discomfort, without immediately rushing to fill it with words, throat clearing, or nervous movement. This does not mean manufacturing awkward silences deliberately, which would simply create discomfort for its own sake. It means resisting the reflexive urge to fill every gap the moment it opens, allowing natural pauses in conversation to exist without visible anxiety about them. This single shift, tolerating silence rather than fleeing from it, is one of the more immediately practicable pieces of this entire audiobook, because it requires no new skill to perform, only the internal work of tolerating a discomfort that most people have spent their whole lives reflexively avoiding. I want to close this chapter with a practical exercise you can begin using today, because everything in this chapter compounds with everything from the two before it. The next time you enter any room, whether a meeting, a party, or simply a crowded coffee shop, spend the first 10 seconds doing 3 specific things before you speak to anyone. Let your shoulders settle down and back rather than curling forward. Choose your path through the room deliberately rather than defensively, and walk it without small evasive adjustments. And once you arrive wherever you are going, resist the urge to immediately fill the moment with speech, allowing yourself several seconds of grounded presence before you begin engaging verbally. This feels uncomfortable the first several times you practice it, and that discomfort is worth naming honestly rather than pretending it disappears instantly. You are overriding years, possibly decades, of unconscious defensive movement patterns, and that override requires conscious effort until it does not anymore. But every person whose social presence you have ever admired built that presence through exactly this kind of repeated, deliberate practice, whether they can articulate the mechanics of it or not. You are simply doing consciously and quickly what they may have stumbled into unconsciously and slowly. The destination is the same. You are just taking a more direct route to get there. The art of the first 7 seconds. A hiring manager once told me something during an interview I was conducting for my own research that I have never forgotten. She said that in 20 years of interviewing candidates, she could predict with unsettling accuracy, within the first several seconds of a candidate walking through the door, whether she was going to recommend them, and that everything said afterward in the interview mostly served to confirm or occasionally overturn a judgment that had already formed almost instantly. She was not proud of this. She considered it a bias she actively worked against. But she was honest enough to admit it existed, and research on interview outcomes largely backs up her instinct. This is uncomfortable to hear if you believe, as most of us are raised to believe, that people judge us primarily on substance, on what we actually say and do and accomplish once given the chance to demonstrate it. The research paints a more complicated picture. Substance matters enormously over time, in sustained relationships and reputations built across months and years. But in that first narrow window, somewhere between 3 and 7 seconds by most estimates, before a word of substance has even been exchanged, an entire provisional verdict has already formed, and that verdict will color the interpretation of everything that follows it. Psychologists call this a form of confirmation bias operating in real time. Once an initial impression forms, even one formed from almost no data, the brain tends to seek out and weight information that confirms it more heavily than information that contradicts it. If you walk into a room and are read, in that first instant, as nervous or low status, subsequent behavior that is actually confident and competent may be unconsciously reinterpreted through that initial lens, filtered to fit the story the room already started telling itself about you. If you walk in and are read as grounded and capable, the opposite tends to happen. Minor stumbles later in the interaction are more likely to be forgiven or overlooked, absorbed into a favorable narrative that was established before you had a chance to prove anything. This means the first 7 seconds are not simply one moment among many in a social interaction. They function more like a lens through which every subsequent moment will be interpreted. Get this window right, and the room becomes generous with you, filling in gaps favorably and forgiving small missteps. Get it wrong, and the room becomes stingy, scrutinizing everything that follows for evidence that confirms the unflattering story it already started writing. So what actually happens inside that window, and how do you use it deliberately rather than leaving it to chance the way most people do? Let's break it into its component parts, because each one is something you can practice. The first component is what I think of as the entrance, the physical act of arriving into a space or into someone's field of attention. Most people, without realizing it, enter rooms in a kind of apologetic crouch, moving quickly to get the moment of arrival over with, eyes down or scanning nervously, shoulders slightly raised toward the ears in a posture that, at a biological level, mirrors a flinch. Compare this to an entrance where the pace is unhurried. The eyes are up and taking in the room deliberately rather than nervously scanning, and the shoulders are settled rather than raised. These are not dramatically different actions. The difference is almost entirely in tempo and tension. But that difference is exactly what the room's rapid judgment machinery is calibrated to detect. I want to be specific about the biology here, because understanding it makes the practice easier to sustain under pressure. When we are anxious, the sympathetic nervous system activates a cascade of physical responses designed for threat response: faster movement, shallower breathing, elevated shoulders, and narrowing of visual attention. These responses evolved for genuine physical danger, not for walking into a conference room, but the nervous system does not reliably distinguish between the two. Learning to consciously slow your entrance, deepen your breath before you walk through a doorway, and deliberately lower your shoulders is not a cosmetic trick. It is a direct intervention into the physiological state driving the very signals the room is reading, and in many cases it begins to actually calm the internal anxiety as well as the outward appearance of it, because body and emotional state run in both directions, feeding each other rather than one simply producing the other. The second component is the greeting itself, and here the research on handshakes, though sometimes treated dismissively as a minor social nicety, turns out to carry real signal weight. Studies on handshake quality have found that a firm, moderate-duration handshake, accompanied by direct eye contact and an open facial expression, is reliably associated with more favorable first impressions across professional and social contexts, while a weak or overly brief handshake tends to correlate with lower ratings of extroversion and emotional stability in observer judgments. The handshake, in other words, functions as a compressed physical signal of the same underlying qualities the rest of this audiobook has been addressing: grounded confidence versus anxious withdrawal. But I want to add a layer of nuance here that the popular advice around handshakes often misses. The goal is not to grip harder in an attempt to project dominance, which frequently overshoots into discomfort or a perceived need to compete rather than connect. The goal is a handshake that matches the effort of a genuine, unhurried greeting between equals, firm without strain, brief eye contact sustained through the greeting rather than glancing away, and ideally accompanied by using the other person's name if you have just been introduced to it, which research on memory and attention consistently finds increases the sense of being genuinely seen and valued in the interaction. The third component, and perhaps the most overlooked, is what happens in your face during those first seconds, specifically whether your expression is congruent with the moment or arrives a beat too late. Genuine warmth expressed through the face, the kind involving the muscles around the eyes rather than the mouth alone, tends to arrive quickly and settle rather than flash on and off in a way that reads as performed. A common failure pattern, particularly among people who are anxious in social settings, involves a kind of facial lag, where the mouth produces a smile intended to seem friendly, but the eyes and the rest of the face have not caught up, creating a visible split-second mismatch that the observer's brain registers, even if only unconsciously, as something slightly off. I want to offer a practical reframe here rather than simply a technique, because I have found the reframe matters more than the mechanics in actually changing behavior under pressure. Most people, entering a socially significant moment, are internally focused on the question of how they are being perceived, which produces exactly the kind of self-monitoring anxiety that generates the incongruent, delayed facial signals we just discussed. The shift that changes this is redirecting your internal focus outward, toward genuine curiosity about the person or room in front of you, rather than inward, toward anxious self-assessment. When your attention is genuinely absorbed in the other person, rather than in monitoring your own performance, the facial congruence problem tends to resolve itself, because you are no longer producing a performed expression layered awkwardly over an anxious internal state. You are simply expressing genuine engagement, because you are, in that moment, genuinely engaged. This connects to something researchers studying social anxiety have long observed: the more self-focused attention someone brings into a social interaction, monitoring their own voice, posture, and words in real time, the more strained and artificial their nonverbal signals tend to become, and the worse the interaction tends to be rated by observers, even when the anxious person believes they performed reasonably well. Conversely, redirecting attention outward, toward genuine interest in the other person, tends to produce more natural, congruent, and well-received nonverbal behavior, almost as a side effect of simply not being available to monitor yourself as closely. I think about the room that didn't see me, that rooftop reception I described at the start of this audiobook, and I can now identify exactly what was happening in my first 7 seconds in that space. I was entirely focused inward, cataloging my own perceived flaws in real time, rehearsing what I would say next rather than actually attending to the people around me. My face, my posture, my pace, all of it was generated by an anxious internal monologue rather than genuine outward engagement, and the room, without any conscious cruelty, read exactly what I was broadcasting and moved on. It would take years of deliberate practice before I understood that the fix was not a better opening line. It was a fundamentally different internal orientation in those first several seconds, from self-monitoring to genuine curiosity, and that shift alone changed more about how rooms responded to me than any specific technique I would go on to learn. Practice this the next time you enter any socially significant space. In the moment before you walk in, consciously set an intention to be curious about the room rather than to be judged well by it. Ask yourself, silently, some version of the question: what is interesting here? Who is interesting here? What might I learn in the next few minutes? This is not a trick to distract yourself from anxiety. It is a genuine redirection of attention that, practiced consistently, changes the actual signals your face, posture, and voice produce in that critical opening window, because those signals are, in the end, downstream of where your attention actually is. What your face says before you speak. Paul Ekman spent much of his career traveling to remote parts of the world, including isolated communities in Papua New Guinea that had almost no contact with Western media or culture, testing a question that seems almost too simple to require rigorous scientific investigation. Are facial expressions of emotion universal across human cultures, or are they learned, culturally specific signals that only make sense within a given society's conventions? His findings, published across decades of research and later refined and debated by subsequent scholars, established that a core set of facial expressions, including those associated with happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise, are recognized with remarkable consistency across radically different cultures, suggesting these expressions are not learned conventions but biological signals wired into the human species. This matters enormously for anyone trying to understand charisma, because it means the face is not simply a canvas you paint intentions onto. It is a broadcasting system with its own grammar, largely outside conscious control, and people around the world, regardless of language or culture, are fluent readers of that grammar whether they realize it or not. Ekman's later research introduced a concept that has become one of the more well-known findings in nonverbal communication: the micro-expression, a facial movement so brief, often less than half a second, that it typically escapes conscious detection by the observer, yet still registers and influences their overall impression at some less conscious level. These micro-expressions occur when someone experiences a genuine emotional reaction that conflicts with the expression they are consciously trying to project, and the true emotion leaks through in a fraction of a second before being suppressed or overridden by the intended expression. I want to be careful here about how this research gets applied, because a great deal of popular content built on Ekman's work oversells the idea that anyone can become a walking lie detector after a weekend of study, reliably spotting deception in others through facial analysis. The actual research is more modest and, frankly, more useful for our purposes than that oversold version. Most people cannot reliably detect specific lies through facial reading alone, even with training, and claims to the contrary should be treated with real skepticism. What the research does robustly support is something different and, for the purposes of building charisma, arguably more valuable: that facial incongruence, a mismatch between what someone is saying and what their face is doing, registers with observers as a general sense of unease or distrust, even when they cannot articulate specifically why, and that facial congruence, where expression and content align authentically, registers as trustworthiness and warmth, again often without the observer being able to explain precisely why they feel that way. This means your task is not to become a master of concealing your true feelings behind a controlled mask, which tends to produce exactly the kind of incongruence that reads as untrustworthy. Your task is closer to the opposite: cultivating genuine internal states, curiosity, warmth, calm confidence, that then express themselves authentically and congruently on your face, because authentic congruent expression is what actually reads as trustworthy to the people around you. Let's talk specifically about the smile, because it is simultaneously the most commonly used and most commonly misused facial signal in social interaction. The distinction Ekman's research made famous, sometimes credited to the earlier work of French anatomist Duchenne de Boulogne, is between what is often called a genuine or Duchenne smile and a social or polite smile. The genuine version engages not just the muscles around the mouth, the zygomatic major that pulls the corners of the mouth upward, but also the muscles around the eyes, the orbicularis oculi, producing the slight crinkling at the outer corners often referred to as crow's feet, along with a subtle lifting of the cheeks that changes the entire shape of the eye region. The polite or social smile typically engages only the mouth, leaving the eyes comparatively unchanged, and observers, again largely without conscious awareness of why, tend to register this version as less genuine, less warm, and in some contexts even as slightly unsettling. Here is what makes this genuinely difficult rather than simply a matter of trying harder to smile with your eyes. The eye-engaging muscles involved in a genuine smile are largely involuntary, meaning they are difficult to consciously activate on command the way you can consciously pull the corners of your mouth upward. This is precisely why the genuine smile serves as such a reliable signal in the first place. It is hard to fake, which is exactly what makes it valuable as an honest signal when it does occur naturally. So if you cannot simply will a genuine smile into existence through effort alone, what can you actually do with this information? The answer circles back to something we touched on in the previous chapter. Genuine facial expression follows genuine internal state far more reliably than it follows conscious effort to perform an expression. If you want your smile to engage your eyes, the more effective path is rarely trying harder to smile correctly, and almost always accessing whatever internal state, genuine amusement, real interest in the person in front of you, actual warmth toward the moment you are in, would naturally produce that smile as a side effect. This is one of many places in this material where the deepest technique turns out to be less about mechanical performance and more about deliberately cultivating the internal state that produces the desired signal automatically and authentically. There is a broader principle buried in this discussion that deserves to be named explicitly, because it will keep recurring throughout the rest of this audiobook. The most reliable path to charismatic nonverbal signaling is very rarely direct mechanical control over each individual signal, learning to consciously arrange your face, your posture, your voice into a checklist of correct positions. That approach tends to produce exactly the kind of subtle incongruence we have been discussing, a performed version of confidence that a room senses is slightly off even when it cannot articulate why. The more reliable path is almost always upstream, cultivating the actual internal states, curiosity, calm, genuine interest in other people, physical groundedness, that produce these signals as natural, congruent byproducts. The mechanical techniques in this audiobook are valuable as training wheels, useful for noticing and correcting glaring patterns of anxious signaling while you build the underlying internal state. But the destination is always internal work expressing itself outwardly, not outward performance layered over an unchanged internal state. I want to close this chapter with something practical that bridges these two layers, because awareness of internal state alone does not always translate into behavioral change without a bridge between them. Before any interaction where you want to project genuine warmth, take a few seconds, even just 3 or 4 seconds, to actually bring to mind something that generates real positive feeling, a person you care about, a recent moment of genuine amusement, simple gratitude for the opportunity in front of you. This is not about performing positivity. It is about briefly and deliberately accessing an actual emotional state that will then express itself authentically on your face and in your voice as you move into the interaction, rather than walking in with whatever neutral or anxious internal state happened to be dominant in the moment beforehand. This small practice, essentially a few seconds of deliberate emotional priming before a socially significant moment, has an outsized effect on how congruent, warm, and genuine your nonverbal signals will read to the people you are about to meet. Before we continue, I want to check in with you again. Earlier, I asked about the word that describes how it feels to be invisible in a room. Now think about the opposite. Comment below. What's the one word for how you want to feel walking into a room instead? Confident? Magnetic? Grounded? Just one word. I'm reading every answer, and I want you to hold that word in mind as we move through the rest of this material, because everything from here forward is built to get you there. The psychology of being remembered. Memory is not a passive recording device. This is one of the more counterintuitive findings to come out of decades of cognitive psychology research, and it has direct, practical implications for how you think about being remembered after a social interaction ends. Human memory is reconstructive rather than photographic. We do not store experiences the way a camera stores footage, to be played back later in perfect fidelity. We store fragments, impressions, and emotional residue, and then reconstruct something that feels like a coherent memory each time we recall it, often filling gaps with plausible details that were never actually part of the original experience. This matters enormously for social presence, because it means the goal of being memorable is not primarily about giving someone more information to store. It is about giving their reconstructive memory system a strong enough emotional or sensory anchor that the reconstruction process reliably produces you, vividly, when triggered later. Most people, trying to be memorable, default to accumulating impressive facts about themselves, achievements, credentials, interesting trivia, under the assumption that more impressive content equals more memorable presence. The research on memory suggests a different lever matters more. Psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's research on how people evaluate and remember experiences introduced a concept relevant here, sometimes called the peak end rule, which found that people's retrospective evaluation of an experience is disproportionately shaped by the most intense moment of that experience, the peak, and by how the experience ended, largely independent of the experience's actual duration or the average quality of the time spent within it. This finding emerged primarily from research on physically or emotionally significant experiences, but its underlying logic extends naturally into how we remember social interactions and the people within them. What this means practically is that a conversation does not need to be uniformly impressive from beginning to end to be remembered favorably. It needs one genuine peak, a moment of real connection, humor, insight, or emotional resonance, and it needs to end well, on a note that leaves a positive final impression rather than trailing off awkwardly or ending on an anxious or rushed note. Someone can forget 90% of the specific content of a conversation with you and still retain a vivid, warm memory of you, if that conversation contained one genuine peak moment and closed cleanly. This reframes how you should think about preparing for socially significant interactions. Rather than trying to be uniformly interesting for the entire duration of a conversation, which is both exhausting and, based on the research, not actually where the memorability lever lies, the more effective approach is identifying or creating one genuine peak, a moment of real laughter, a piece of insight that lands, a question that produces genuine reflection in the other person, and then being deliberate about how the interaction closes, ensuring it ends on warmth and positive energy, rather than fizzling out. There is a second body of research relevant here, concerning what is sometimes called the distinctiveness effect in memory research, the well-established finding that information which stands out from its surrounding context is disproportionately more likely to be encoded into durable memory than information that blends into an undifferentiated stream of similar experiences. This is why, at a networking event where someone has 15 similar conversations in a row, all following roughly the same script of names, job titles, and small talk, the version of you that gets remembered is very rarely the one that followed that script most smoothly. It is the version that introduced something distinctive into the pattern, a genuine moment of specificity, humor, or unexpected depth that broke the monotonous rhythm the other person had otherwise been moving through all evening. I want to translate this into something concrete you can use, because the principle is easy to understand and surprisingly rare to see actually practiced. In any conversation where being remembered matters to you, resist the urge to move through the standard script of surface-level small talk for the entire duration of the interaction. Somewhere within the conversation, deliberately introduce a moment of genuine specificity, a real opinion rather than a safe one, a genuine question that requires actual reflection rather than a scripted one, a piece of authentic humor rather than a rehearsed line. This does not need to happen at the start. In fact, research on conversational rapport suggests it often lands better once some baseline comfort has been established. But it does need to happen at some point, because without it, you risk becoming one of 15 interchangeable conversations in someone else's evening, competent and pleasant and instantly forgettable. There is also a name-related finding worth mentioning here, because it connects directly to memorability in a very practical way. Research on the psychology of names has consistently found that people respond with heightened attention and positive effect when their own name is used naturally in conversation, a phenomenon sometimes linked to the general finding that one's own name serves as a particularly potent attentional cue, capable of cutting through inattention in ways that other words typically cannot. Using someone's name once, naturally, early in a conversation, rather than either avoiding it entirely or repeating it so often it becomes obviously strategic, tends to increase both their engagement in the moment and their memory of the interaction afterward. I want to add one more layer to this chapter, because it connects back to something from a much earlier chapter and deserves reinforcement here. Emotional intensity, more than informational density, is what memory systems prioritize for long-term storage. This is why you can likely remember the emotional texture of conversations from years ago, how someone made you feel, whether a moment was warm or awkward or exciting, far more reliably than you can remember the specific words that were exchanged. This is not a flaw in memory. It is the system working exactly as it evolved to work, prioritizing emotionally significant information because, across evolutionary history, emotional significance was usually a reliable proxy for survival relevance. The implication for how you show up socially is worth sitting with. If you want to be remembered, the highest leverage investment is very rarely accumulating more interesting facts to share. It is creating genuine emotional resonance, even briefly, even in a short interaction. A moment of real laughter shared together. A question that makes someone feel genuinely seen rather than merely processed through a script. a closing moment of warmth rather than an abrupt or anxious exit. These small emotional peaks are what the reconstructive memory system will reach for later, when someone tries to recall who you were and how the interaction with you felt, and they matter more than almost any amount of impressive content delivered without them. Listening as a weapon of influence. I want to open this chapter with a claim that tends to surprise people the first time they encounter it, because it runs against almost everything popular advice about charisma emphasizes. The single most underused tool in the entire architecture of social influence is not speaking better. It is listening better, and the research supporting this claim is far more robust than most people assume. Psychologist Carl Rogers, whose work laid much of the foundation for modern therapeutic practice, developed and extensively researched a concept he called active listening, a mode of attention that goes considerably beyond simply waiting for your turn to speak. Rogers's research and clinical observation found that when people feel genuinely heard, fully attended to without interruption, judgment, or the listener's attention visibly drifting toward formulating their own response, something significant shifts in the emotional quality of the interaction. The person being listened to relaxes, opens up, and, critically for our purposes, tends to form a strong positive association with the person who provided that quality of attention, often without being able to fully articulate why that particular conversation felt so different from most others they have. This matters enormously for charisma because most people, in ordinary social interaction, are not actually listening in the way Rogers described. They are engaged in what researchers sometimes call listening to respond rather than listening to understand, a mode where a significant portion of attention during the other person's speech is occupied with formulating what to say next, rather than fully absorbing what is actually being communicated in the moment. This produces a subtle but detectable quality of distraction, a slight delay in response, a tendency to respond to a slightly different point than what was actually raised, that the speaker registers, often unconsciously, as not being fully attended to. The person who has trained themselves to actually listen, fully, without the internal noise of response formulation running simultaneously, becomes disproportionately rare and disproportionately magnetic in almost any social context, precisely because so few people experience that quality of attention in ordinary life. This is not a minor technique buried among many equally important ones. Based on the accumulated research on rapport and interpersonal connection, it may be the single highest leverage skill in this entire audiobook, and it is almost entirely overlooked in popular treatments of charisma that focus overwhelmingly on how to speak rather than how to attend. Let's get specific about what genuine listening actually looks like in practice, because the concept is easy to state and surprisingly difficult to execute consistently, especially in a culture that trains us from childhood to prepare our next contribution while others are still speaking. The first component is what researchers sometimes call full sensory attention, meaning your eyes, body, and attention are oriented toward the speaker rather than scanning the room, checking a phone, or angling toward an exit. This sounds obvious, but observe most conversations at a party or networking event and you will notice how rarely it is actually practiced. Most people's eyes drift. Most people's bodies angle slightly away, or toward other conversations happening nearby, a subtle signal of divided attention that the speaker registers even when both parties are being polite enough not to name it. The second component is resisting the urge to interrupt, not simply out of politeness, but because interruption, even well-intentioned interruption meant to add value or show engagement, breaks the speaker's train of thought and, more importantly, signals that your own contribution matters more than allowing them to complete theirs. This is genuinely difficult for socially engaged, quick-thinking people, who often interrupt precisely because they are excited and want to contribute meaningfully to the conversation. But research on conversational dynamics consistently finds that the person who interrupts less, allowing more complete space for the other person's thoughts, is rated as a better, more charismatic conversational partner, even when their own individual contributions are less frequent or less impressive in isolation. The third component, and this is where active listening becomes genuinely active rather than passive, is reflection, briefly and naturally paraphrasing or acknowledging what the other person has said before adding your own perspective, rather than immediately pivoting to your own point the moment they finish speaking. This does not need to be a formal or robotic restatement. It can be as simple as a brief acknowledgement that demonstrates you actually absorbed the specific content of what was said, rather than generic filler that could apply to nearly anything, which tends to signal that you are not fully listening at all. I want to connect this back to the two-dimensional framework from earlier in this audiobook, warmth and competence, because active listening is one of the rare behaviors that builds both simultaneously, and that is precisely why it carries such outsized influence. Genuine attentive listening signals warmth, because it communicates that the other person's thoughts and feelings matter enough to receive your full attention. But it also, somewhat counterintuitively, signals competence and status, because the ability to sit with genuine patience, to resist the reflexive urge to fill space with your own contribution, itself reads as a form of confidence and self-possession. The person who needs to constantly insert themselves into the conversation, who cannot tolerate letting someone else hold the floor for an extended period, unconsciously signals a kind of status anxiety and need to prove their value through constant verbal contribution. The person who can listen fully, patiently, without that anxious need to insert themselves, signals the opposite, a security so complete it does not require constant verbal reinforcement. There is a particularly powerful application of this principle worth naming explicitly, because it directly counters one of the more common misconceptions about charisma. Many people assume that commanding a room requires talking more, dominating airtime, ensuring your voice is heard above others. The research, and honestly my own extensive observation of people who genuinely command respect in social settings, points towards something closer to the opposite. The people who are most respected in group settings are very often not the ones who speak most frequently. They are the ones whose contributions, when they do speak, carry disproportionate weight, precisely because those contributions are relatively rare, clearly the product of genuine listening to what came before, and delivered with the calm, unhurried confidence we covered several chapters back. I want to give you something concrete to practice, because this chapter, more than most others in this audiobook, requires behavioral discipline rather than simply new information. In your next several conversations, deliberately practice waiting a full 2 seconds after the other person finishes speaking before you respond, rather than jumping in the instant they pause for breath. This will feel uncomfortable at first, almost unnaturally slow, because most casual conversation operates with response gaps far shorter than this. But that discomfort is precisely the anxious need to fill space that we have been discussing throughout this chapter, and tolerating it is the practice. Within that 2-second pause, resist the urge to use the time to formulate your response, and instead use it to genuinely register what was just said. You will likely find that your responses, once you begin speaking, are sharper and more genuinely connected to what the other person actually said, rather than a parallel track of pre-formulated content you were assembling while they were still talking. This single practice, extended consistently across enough interactions, tends to produce a noticeable shift in how people respond to you socially. You will likely notice people opening up more, sharing more, and, over time, actively seeking you out in group settings, often without being able to articulate exactly why conversations with you feel different from conversations with most other people. The answer, in most cases, will be exactly what this chapter has been describing. You were not simply waiting for your turn. You were actually there. The language patterns of natural leaders. There is a specific pattern of speech that researchers studying leadership communication have identified repeatedly across contexts ranging from corporate boardrooms to political speeches to informal group settings, and once you learn to recognize it, you will hear it everywhere, in every leader whose communication genuinely moves people, and its absence everywhere in communication that fails to land despite technically correct content. The pattern involves the ratio and placement of certainty language versus hedging language, and the research on this distinction is more consequential than its dry academic framing suggests. Hedging language includes qualifiers like I think, maybe, sort of, kind of, I could be wrong but, and similar phrases that soften a statement's certainty before it has even been fully delivered. In moderate amounts, hedging serves a genuine and important social function, signaling appropriate epistemic humility and inviting collaborative discussion rather than closing it down. But research on persuasive and leadership communication consistently finds that excessive hedging, particularly around statements the speaker actually does believe with confidence, undermines perceived competence and authority, making the speaker sound less certain of their own expertise than they actually are, and, by extension, giving the listener less reason to defer to that expertise. The natural leaders this chapter is named for, the people whose words seem to carry unusual weight in a room, are not simply people who never hedge. Overcorrecting into a habit of never hedging at all tends to produce a different problem, a kind of brittle overconfidence that reads as arrogance or a lack of intellectual honesty, particularly in contexts where genuine uncertainty exists and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What actually distinguishes charismatic, credible communicators is more precise. They hedge deliberately and selectively, reserving certainty language for the points that matter most and the areas where they genuinely do have confidence, while being honest about hedging in areas of genuine uncertainty. This selective use of certainty, rather than blanket confidence or blanket hedging, is what research finds most strongly associated with perceived competence, because it signals that the speaker's confidence is calibrated to actual knowledge rather than either performed uniformly or absent uniformly. I want to give you a concrete technique here, because this is one of the more immediately actionable shifts available in this entire audiobook. Go back through how you typically phrase your opinions and observations in conversation, and notice how often you preface genuine convictions, things you actually believe with real confidence, with unnecessary softening language. I could be wrong, but I think this is probably a bad idea, but practice removing the unnecessary hedge from statements you actually believe, replacing I think maybe we should consider possibly trying with a direct we should try this, and reserve your genuine hedges for the places where authentic uncertainty exists rather than scattering them reflexively across everything you say as a kind of social insurance against being wrong. There is a second pattern worth examining closely, concerning the use of what linguists sometimes call filler language, the ums, us, and likes that occupy space during moments of verbal hesitation. Research on speech patterns and perceived competence consistently finds that filler-heavy speech is associated with lower ratings of confidence and credibility, largely because filler words function as audible evidence of uncertainty or unpreparedness, even when the underlying content being delivered is actually sound. This connects back to the pause principle from the chapter on vocal delivery. The instinct to fill every gap with or a comes from the same discomfort with silence that produces rushed speech and reflexive conversational filling more broadly. The fix is the same one covered earlier, consciously tolerating brief silence rather than filling it, allowing a genuine pause to occupy the space where a filler word would otherwise go. A third linguistic pattern worth naming concerns the structure of how ideas are delivered, specifically the difference between what communication researchers sometimes call front-loaded versus back-loaded statements. Front-loaded communication states the main point first, directly, before elaborating on supporting detail or context. Back-loaded communication builds through context and detail before eventually arriving at the main point. Research on persuasive communication and perceived clarity consistently favors front-loading in most professional and social contexts, particularly in fast-paced settings where listener attention cannot be guaranteed to sustain through an extended build-up. Leaders whose communication reads as clear and confident tend to state their core point early, then use supporting detail to reinforce rather than to build suspense toward a conclusion the listener has to wait for. This does not mean storytelling and narrative build-up have no place in charismatic communication. We will spend considerable time in later chapters on the specific power of narrative structure, which often deliberately delays its point for dramatic effect, and that structure serves a genuinely different purpose than the direct, front-loaded structure that serves clarity and authority in more straightforward exchanges. The skill is knowing which mode a given moment calls for: front-loaded clarity when the goal is to communicate a decision, a recommendation, or a piece of information efficiently, and narrative build-up when the goal is emotional engagement and connection. Using narrative build-up in a moment that calls for clarity reads as evasive or unable to get to the point. Using blunt front-loaded delivery in a moment that calls for emotional connection reads as cold or transactional. Both are tools. Neither is universally correct, and the natural leaders this chapter examines are distinguished less by mastering one mode than by fluently reading which mode a given moment requires. I want to touch on one more linguistic pattern before closing this chapter, concerning pronoun use, because research in this area has produced findings that are genuinely counterintuitive and worth understanding precisely because they run against common assumptions about confident communication. You might expect that confident, high-status speech would be heavily saturated with first-person language. I did this, I believe that, I accomplished this. Research on language and social status actually finds a more nuanced pattern. Excessive first-person singular pronoun use, particularly the word I, has been associated in several studies with lower perceived status and, in some research contexts, with markers of anxiety or self-focus rather than confidence. Genuinely high-status speech, by contrast, often uses first-person language more sparingly, focused instead on the subject matter itself, on other people, or on collective framing, we, this, the situation, rather than constantly centering the speaker's own perspective explicitly. The interpretation researchers have offered for this pattern is worth sitting with. Constant explicit self-reference can unconsciously signal a kind of insecurity, a need to continually assert one's own presence and perspective in the conversation, as though worried that perspective might otherwise be overlooked. Genuinely secure communicators, confident that their perspective is already being attended to without needing to constantly flag it, tend to speak in a way that centers the subject matter or the other person more naturally, trusting that their own voice and authority come through the substance of what they are saying rather than requiring constant explicit reassertion. I want to be careful not to overstate this into a rigid rule, because eliminating first-person language entirely produces its own stilted, evasive quality that carries none of the benefits described here. The point is not to avoid saying I. It is to notice when I is being used to actually convey information. I recommend this approach, versus when it is functioning as a kind of anxious verbal tick, reflexively inserted throughout speech as a way of continually reasserting presence in the conversation. Reducing the second category, while leaving the first fully intact, tends to produce speech that reads as more grounded and more genuinely confident, without sacrificing the clarity and ownership that legitimate first-person statements provide. Practice this by simply paying attention, over the next several days, to how often you use I in ordinary conversation, and notice which instances are actually necessary to convey your meaning versus which are reflexive verbal habit. You do not need to eliminate the habitual instances entirely, and trying to do so in real time will likely make your speech sound stilted and overly monitored, which carries its own costs we discussed earlier in this audiobook. But simply building the awareness, over time, tends to naturally shift the ratio in the direction the research associates with confident, high-status communication, without requiring the kind of constant conscious effort that would itself undermine the natural, congruent quality that makes any of these techniques actually effective. Turning tension into trust. Not every social interaction begins from neutral ground. Some of the most consequential moments for building genuine presence and influence happen precisely when tension already exists. A disagreement, a moment of conflict, a conversation where the other person arrives defensive, skeptical, or outright hostile. Most people, understandably, experience these moments as threats to be minimized or escaped as quickly as possible. But research on conflict, negotiation, and trust building suggests something worth taking seriously. Tension, handled skillfully, is not merely an obstacle to connection. It is frequently the fastest route to it. Psychologist John Gottman, whose decades of research primarily examined what predicts the success or failure of marriages, developed a body of work that turns out to generalize far beyond romantic relationships into nearly any interpersonal context involving conflict. One of Gottman's central findings concerns what he called bids for connection, small verbal or non-verbal attempts one person makes to gain another's attention, affirmation, or affection during interaction. Gottman's research found that relationships thrive or deteriorate based substantially on how consistently these bids are met with what he termed turning toward, genuine responsive attention, versus turning away, ignoring or deflecting the bid, or turning against, responding with hostility or dismissiveness. This concept applies directly to tense or difficult conversations, because even hostile or defensive communication frequently contains embedded bids for connection, disguised as complaint, frustration, or accusation. Someone expressing frustration is very often, underneath the surface content of the complaint, making a bid to be heard, validated, or taken seriously. The person who can recognize this, and respond by turning toward the underlying bid rather than reacting defensively to the surface hostility, tends to de-escalate tension far more effectively than someone who responds to the literal content alone. I want to give you a specific technique here that comes directly out of this research and out of clinical and negotiation practice more broadly: validation before response. When someone approaches you with frustration, disagreement, or defensiveness, the instinct most people follow is to immediately begin building their counterargument, formulating the response that will correct the other person's perception or defend their own position. Research on de-escalation consistently finds a more effective sequence, briefly and genuinely acknowledging the emotional content of what the other person expressed, before addressing the substantive content of their point. This does not mean agreeing with a position you disagree with, and it is important to be precise about that distinction, because conflating validation with capitulation is a common and costly misunderstanding of this technique. Validating someone's emotional experience, "I can see why that would be frustrating," or "that makes sense given what you were expecting," is entirely separate from validating the correctness of their position. You can fully validate that someone's frustration is understandable, while still disagreeing with their underlying conclusion. What this sequencing accomplishes is de-escalating the emotional temperature of the interaction before attempting to engage with it substantively, because people in a state of emotional activation, feeling unheard or dismissed, are neurologically less capable of engaging with logical counterargument in a receptive way. Skipping directly to the counterargument, however well-reasoned, while the other person's emotional bid remains unaddressed, tends to escalate rather than resolve the tension, because it confirms their underlying fear of not being heard. There is a physiological dimension to this worth understanding, because it explains why skipping the validation step so reliably backfires. When a person experiences a strong negative emotional state, frustration, feeling dismissed, feeling attacked, the body's stress response activates, and this activation measurably impairs the kind of flexible, receptive thinking required to genuinely consider an opposing viewpoint. This is sometimes referred to informally as the interaction being hijacked by the more reactive, threat-oriented systems of the brain, at the expense of the more deliberative systems required for open-minded reconsideration. Attempting to reason someone out of that state with logic alone, before addressing the emotional activation driving it, is frequently as ineffective as it feels in the moment, because the receptive cognitive machinery required to actually process the logic is, for those first crucial moments, substantially offline. Validation, done genuinely, begins to lower that physiological activation, creating the conditions under which the other person becomes actually capable of hearing and considering what you have to say next. This is not manipulation. It is an accurate application of how human emotional and cognitive systems interact under stress, and using it is simply meeting the other person where they actually are, rather than where you wish they were for the sake of a more efficient conversation. I want to address the ethical dimension directly here, because this chapter sits close to territory that could easily slide into manipulation if handled carelessly, and I promised earlier in this audiobook that we would keep returning to that line. Validation used to genuinely understand and de-escalate, before engaging honestly with a disagreement, is an ethical practice, because it treats the other person's emotional experience as real and worthy of acknowledgement regardless of whether you ultimately agree with their position. Validation used cynically, as a scripted technique deployed purely to lower someone's guard before manipulating them toward a predetermined outcome regardless of the actual merits of the conversation, crosses into something else entirely. The technique itself is identical in both cases. What differs is the intention behind it, and, frequently, whether the eventual substantive engagement that follows the validation is honest or itself manipulative. I would ask you to hold this distinction seriously as you practice these skills, because the line, while sometimes subtle in the moment, is not actually ambiguous when you examine your own intentions honestly. There is a related skill worth introducing here, sometimes discussed in negotiation research under the heading of tactical empathy, a term popularized by former hostage negotiator Chris Voss, drawing on principles that overlap significantly with the psychological research already discussed in this chapter. Tactical empathy involves not simply feeling empathy internally, but actively demonstrating an accurate understanding of the other person's perspective, explicitly and out loud, in a way they can confirm or correct. This might sound like naming the specific concern you believe underlies someone's frustration, framed as a genuine attempt at understanding rather than an accusation. It sounds like this feels like it caught you off guard, or it seems like the real concern here is timing, more than the offer itself, delivered as an open observation the other person can confirm, refine, or correct, rather than a closed statement that forecloses further discussion. This technique accomplishes something psychologically important beyond simple de-escalation. When someone hears their internal state named accurately by another person, it produces a strong sense of being genuinely understood, which research on trust building consistently finds accelerates rapport more effectively than almost any other single conversational move. It also, practically, surfaces the actual underlying concern driving a disagreement, which is frequently different from the surface content of the complaint, allowing the conversation to address what actually matters rather than continuing to circle a surface-level symptom of a deeper issue. I want to close this chapter with a broader point about tension in social settings generally, beyond direct conflict. Mild social tension, disagreement, a provocative question, a moment where consensus briefly breaks, is not something charismatic communicators avoid entirely, and this itself surprises people who assume charisma means being universally agreeable and conflict-averse. Research on group dynamics and leadership perception finds that people who never disagree, who default reflexively to agreement and consensus in every situation, are often perceived as less confident and less trustworthy than those willing to voice genuine disagreement when it exists, delivered with the validating, non-hostile approach this chapter has described. Constant agreement reads, at some level, as a lack of genuine independent perspective, or worse, as a strategic unwillingness to risk the disapproval that honest disagreement might provoke. This means part of building genuine charismatic presence involves becoming comfortable with the mild tension of respectful disagreement, rather than treating all tension as something to be avoided at all costs. Learning to disagree with warmth, validating the other person's perspective before offering a genuinely different one, rather than either suppressing your actual view to preserve surface harmony or delivering disagreement bluntly without acknowledgement of the other person's position, is itself one of the more advanced applications of everything this audiobook has covered so far. It requires the vocal calm from a chapter on voice, the tolerance for silence and mild discomfort from a chapter on owning space, and the genuine listening from the previous chapter, all working together in a single, more demanding social moment. This is advanced work, and it is worth treating it as such rather than expecting it to feel comfortable immediately. The ethics of social power. I have referenced an ethical line throughout this audiobook without yet giving it the sustained attention it deserves, and I want to correct that now, because I believe this chapter may be the most important one in the entire work, even though it will not teach you a single new technique. Everything covered so far in this audiobook, reading and producing nonverbal signals, calibrating vocal delivery, mastering the first 7 seconds, listening actively, de-escalating tension, is, without exception, a tool that can be used toward genuinely different ends. The same skill that helps a therapist build enough trust with a frightened patient to enable real healing can help a con artist build enough trust with a victim to enable real theft. The same active listening that makes a friend feel genuinely heard can make a predator's target feel genuinely understood in a way that lowers defenses that should have stayed raised. I do not say this to be alarmist. I say it because I believe treating these tools as morally neutral, teachable to anyone regardless of intention, is itself a choice with consequences, and I want to be honest with you about where I stand on it rather than pretending this material exists in some ethically weightless space. Robert Cialdini, whose research on the psychology of influence and persuasion has shaped much of the modern understanding of social compliance, spent considerable effort in his later work distinguishing between what he calls ethical and unethical applications of the same underlying principles. His research identified several core principles that reliably move people toward compliance: reciprocity, the tendency to feel obligated to return favors; social proof, the tendency to look to others' behavior for guidance on our own; authority, the tendency to defer to perceived expertise; liking, the tendency to be more easily influenced by people we like; scarcity, the tendency to value things perceived as rare or limited; and commitment and consistency, the tendency to act in ways consistent with prior commitments we have made. Every one of these principles, Cialdini's own writing is explicit about this, can be deployed honestly, where the reciprocity offered is genuine, the social proof cited is accurate, the authority claimed is real, the liking cultivated is authentic, the scarcity described is true, and the commitment invoked was actually freely made. Or every one of them can be manufactured falsely: fake reciprocity through manipulative guilt, fabricated social proof, false claims of authority, performed liking with no genuine basis, artificial scarcity that does not actually exist, and commitments engineered through manipulation rather than freely given. The mechanism is identical in both cases. What differs entirely is whether the underlying claim being leveraged is true. I want to offer you a test I have used personally, and one I would encourage you to actually use, not just read past, as you apply everything in this audiobook going forward. Before using any technique from this material in a specific interaction, ask yourself honestly, if the other person could see exactly what I am doing and why, in this exact moment, would they feel manipulated, or would they feel understood? If the honest answer is that they would feel manipulated, that the technique is functioning specifically because they cannot see it clearly, you have crossed from social skill into manipulation, regardless of how the technique is labeled or where it appears in this material. If the honest answer is that they would feel understood, that transparency about the technique would not undermine its effect because the underlying warmth, interest, or validation it expresses is genuine, you are almost certainly on ethical ground. This test matters because nearly every technique in this audiobook passes it when used honestly and fails it when used cynically, and the difference is invisible from the outside. Active listening, done because you are genuinely curious about the other person, passes this test easily. A room could watch you do it and see nothing but attentive care. Active listening, deployed purely as a manipulation technique to make a target feel comfortable enough to lower defenses that should stay raised, fails this test badly, and the failure would be obvious to anyone who understood your actual intention in the moment. The behavior looks identical. The intention, and the honesty of that intention if examined openly, is where the entire ethical weight of this material lives. I want to address something else directly, because I think it matters for how you carry this material forward. Some people, encountering research on social influence and status signaling for the first time, experience a kind of disillusionment, a sense that if charisma can be broken down into learnable mechanics, something is somehow less authentic about people who possess it, as though natural charisma is real and constructed charisma is a kind of counterfeit. I want to push back on this directly, because I think it reflects a misunderstanding of what authenticity actually means. Every socially fluent person you have ever admired learned these skills somehow, whether through explicit study, as you are doing now, or through years of unconscious absorption, trial, error, and social feedback that gradually shaped their instincts without them ever consciously naming the mechanics involved. There is no meaningful category of naturally charismatic people who are simply born knowing how to modulate vocal pitch, read facial microexpressions, and calibrate warmth against competence. What we call natural charisma is, in nearly every case, learned charisma, acquired implicitly rather than explicitly, often at a younger age or through more socially advantageous circumstances than the rest of us had access to. Learning these same skills explicitly, as an adult, deliberately, is not a lesser or more artificial path to the same destination. It is simply a more conscious route to a place other people arrived at less consciously, and there is nothing inauthentic about consciously building a skill that others acquired by accident of circumstance. What would be inauthentic, and what this chapter is specifically warning against, is using these skills to construct a false version of yourself, projecting warmth you do not feel, competence you do not have, or trustworthiness you do not deserve, in order to extract something from people that honest representation would not have earned you. That is a fundamentally different project from what this audiobook has been teaching, and I want to make sure that distinction has not gotten lost anywhere in the practical detail of the previous chapters. The goal of everything in this material is closing the gap between who you actually are, including the confidence, warmth, and capability you are genuinely capable of, and what the world perceives of you in those first critical seconds and throughout sustained interaction. It is not constructing a persona disconnected from your actual character. If you walk away from this audiobook only with mechanical techniques, and without this underlying orientation toward honest self-expression rather than manufactured performance, you will likely find that the techniques eventually fail you, because incongruence, as we discussed several chapters back, leaks through in ways that people register even when they cannot articulate why. The people who build lasting, genuine social presence using this material are the ones who use it in service of accurately representing something real, not in service of constructing something false. Commanding a room without dominating it. There is a particular failure mode that people encounter after learning material like what this audiobook has covered, and I want to address it directly before we move toward the closing chapters, because I have watched it happen to people I have coached, and I made a version of this mistake myself early in my own development. Having learned the mechanics of status signaling, expansive posture, vocal authority, reduced hedging, some people overcorrect into a kind of performed dominance that technically executes the individual techniques correctly while producing an overall effect that reads as aggressive, self-centered, or exhausting to be around, rather than genuinely magnetic. This chapter exists to draw a distinction that the research on leadership and social influence returns to repeatedly: the difference between dominance and prestige as two genuinely separate routes to social status, identified and studied extensively by researchers including Joey Cheng and Joseph Henrich, whose work examined how status hierarchies form and stabilize in human groups. Dominance-based status is achieved through intimidation, control of resources, and the ability to inflict costs on others, essentially status through the fear of what someone could do to you if crossed. Prestige-based status is achieved through demonstrated competence, generosity, and skills that others genuinely value, essentially status through the recognition of what someone could do for the group and a genuine desire to learn from or associate with them. Both routes to status are real, and both produce measurable social influence. But the research is fairly clear that they produce very different qualities of relationship with the people around the status holder. Dominance produces compliance, often accompanied by underlying resentment, a desire to see the dominant figure fail, and relationships that dissolve rapidly once the dominant figure's ability to inflict costs is removed. Prestige produces genuine willing deference, admiration that persists even when the prestigious figure has no power over the people who admire them, and relationships that tend to be more stable and more genuinely warm. Here is why this distinction matters directly for everything covered in this audiobook. Several of the techniques discussed, expansive posture, reduced hedging, vocal authority, tolerance for silence, can be deployed in service of either dominance or prestige, and the same technique, deployed slightly differently or in a different overall context, can land as either one. The differentiator, more than any single technique, is whether the overall pattern of behavior also includes signals of warmth, genuine interest in others, and a willingness to yield space rather than only claim it, or whether it consists purely of status-claiming signals without any accompanying warmth. This connects back to the warmth and competence framework from earlier in this audiobook, and I want to draw the connection explicitly here because it resolves the tension this chapter opened with. Pure status-claiming behavior, without warmth, tends to be read by others as dominance-seeking, and dominance-seeking behavior, even when it succeeds at commanding short-term attention, tends to produce the resentment and instability the research on dominance-based status describes. The genuinely magnetic version of commanding a room, the version this entire audiobook has been building toward, requires status signals paired consistently with warmth signals. The expansive, grounded posture combined with genuine attentive listening, the reduced hedging combined with genuine openness to being wrong, the vocal authority combined with authentic care for the people in the conversation. I want to give you a concrete practice for calibrating this balance, because it is easy to state as a principle and harder to execute consistently in the moment, particularly when social anxiety pulls people toward overcorrection in one direction or the other. Before entering any socially significant interaction, ask yourself which of the two you are naturally more prone to defaulting toward under pressure. Some people, particularly those with a history of social anxiety or invisibility, tend to overcorrect toward excessive warmth and accommodation once they gain some social confidence, becoming so focused on being liked and avoiding any hint of dominance that they undersell their own competence and status, remaining pleasant but ultimately unremarkable. Others, particularly those who have recently and enthusiastically absorbed material on status and confidence, tend to overcorrect in the opposite direction, becoming so focused on claiming status that warmth gets crowded out, producing a kind of charisma that impresses briefly but exhausts or alienates over sustained contact. Knowing your own default lean matters because it tells you which half of this balance requires more conscious attention. If you tend to default toward excessive accommodation, the growth edge is likely in the status-claiming behaviors covered throughout this audiobook: reducing hedging, tolerating silence, occupying space more fully, disagreeing when genuine disagreement exists rather than defaulting to consensus. If you tend to default toward status claiming, particularly after recently learning material like this, the growth edge is likely in consistently pairing that status with genuine warmth, active listening practiced with real discipline, validating others before asserting your own view, yielding space in conversation rather than only claiming it, expressing genuine curiosity about people rather than performing interest as a strategic accessory to your own status display. I want to introduce one more concept here that ties this chapter together, something researchers studying charismatic leadership sometimes describe as the difference between charisma that centers the self and charisma that centers others. The most magnetic people in almost any room, when you observe them closely over time rather than in a single brief encounter, are very often not the people working hardest to be impressive. They are the people who make the people around them feel more impressive, more interesting, more capable, simply by virtue of how they engage. This is not a contradiction of the status signaling material covered throughout this audiobook. It is its most mature application, status secure enough that it does not need to be constantly asserted, freeing the person to direct their attention and energy toward elevating the people around them rather than continuously proving their own worth. This is, I think, the actual answer to the question this chapter's title poses. Commanding a room without dominating it is not a matter of finding some careful midpoint between confidence and humility, executed with precise moderation in every interaction. It is a matter of security, genuine internal security built through the practice this entire audiobook has described, secure enough that status no longer needs to be the point of the interaction at all. The confidence becomes the foundation from which you can afford to genuinely attend to, elevate, and connect with the people around you, rather than the confidence itself being the performance you are asking the room to witness and validate. The person they never forget. I want to take you back to that rooftop, the one from the opening of this audiobook, because I have thought about that night many times in the years since, and I want to walk you through it one more time, except this time, I want you to watch it happen differently. The room is the same. The people are, in some meaningful sense, the same too, strangers gathered in a space designed to produce exactly the kind of superficial networking encounters that leave almost everyone involved forgettable to almost everyone else. But the person walking through the door is not the same person who walked through that door years ago, cataloguing his own inadequacies before he had said a single word to anyone. He enters at an unhurried pace, shoulders settled rather than raised, eyes up and genuinely taking in the room rather than nervously scanning for an escape route or a safe corner. He is not thinking about how he is being perceived. He is genuinely curious about who is in this room and what he might learn tonight, and that curiosity, rather than anxious self-monitoring, is what organizes his attention as he crosses the space. He does not aim for the largest, most impressive-looking conversation circle, the one that would have intimidated him into paralysis years earlier. He finds someone standing slightly apart, someone who, based on everything covered in this audiobook, is very likely experiencing some version of the same invisibility he once lived inside. He approaches without rehearsing an opening line, offers a genuine greeting, a name, a firm and unhurried handshake, direct eye contact held through the exchange rather than glancing away. And then, and this is the part that took him the longest to learn, he listens. Not performing listening while formulating his next contribution, but actually listening, fully, the way Carl Rogers described decades ago, the way almost nobody in that room is currently doing for anyone else. He lets silence exist in the conversation without rushing to fill it. He responds to what is actually said rather than to a nearby point he had already prepared. Somewhere in the conversation, he offers a genuine reaction rather than a safe one, a real opinion, a piece of authentic humor, something that breaks the script both of them have been running through 15 identical conversations all evening. He notices the shift when it happens, a slight lean forward, an unguarded laugh, the particular quality of attention that appears when someone stops performing a script and starts genuinely engaging. He does not try to be the most impressive person in the conversation. He tries to make the person in front of him feel like the most interesting person in the room, because he has learned, through years of research and practice, that this is very often the same thing, approached from the more generous and ultimately more effective direction. When the conversation reaches a natural point of closure, he does not simply drift away or get pulled towards someone else without acknowledgement, the way most exits happen in rooms like this. He closes it deliberately, with warmth, referencing something specific from what was actually discussed, leaving the peak-end principle from earlier in this audiobook working in his favor rather than against it. And then he moves on, genuinely curious about who else is in the room, carrying forward the same grounded presence rather than resetting into anxiety with each new person he approaches. By the end of the night, he has not spoken to everyone in the room, and he has not performed for anyone. But the handful of people he did genuinely connect with will remember him, not because he accumulated impressive facts to share, but because, in a room full of people running scripts, he was actually present, and presence, it turns out, is the rarest and most memorable thing you can offer anyone in a crowded room. This is the person this entire audiobook has been building toward, and I want to be honest with you about something as we close. This version of presence was not available to me the night I actually stood on that rooftop, invisible and cataloguing my own failures in real time. It took years of the research and practice detailed across every chapter of this material, expansive posture and vocal authority, the discipline of genuine listening, the courage to tolerate silence, the ethical clarity to use all of it honestly, before that room, or any room, began responding to me the way I have just described. I am telling you this not to suggest the timeline will be identical for you, because it will not be. Everyone's starting point and practice is different. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that the gap between who you are right now and the person who walks into a room and is genuinely, memorably present is not a gap of personality or worth. It is a gap of skill, and skill, unlike personality, is something you can deliberately build, one deliberate practice at a time, the same way I did, the same way every genuinely charismatic person you have ever admired did, whether they can name the mechanics of it or not. You are not invisible because something is wrong with you. You were simply never taught a language that everyone around you has been fluently, unconsciously reading and writing your entire life. That language can be learned. This audiobook has given you the grammar. What remains is practice, the same patient, deliberate practice behind every skill worth having, applied to rooms, conversations, and relationships until what once felt effortful becomes, simply, who you are. Earlier, I asked you what word described how it felt to be invisible in a room, and later, what word you wanted to feel instead. Go back and drop that second word in the comments if you haven't yet. I want to see where you're heading, and I mean that. And if this changed how you think about walking into a room, subscribe. There's more of this every week, built for people who are done being forgettable.